Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel, and welcome back to our new Mutants and Ideological Evolution series, where we track character development that happened during Chris Claremont's iconic 54-issue run on the New Mutants. And today we're taking a look at a member who gets added as the story is moving along, and that is Douglas Ramsey, aka Cypher. And I think Doug is a pretty unique character in this run because he may not have the most physically impressive mutant ability, and he may not have very much combat prowess, but his mutant ability enables him to understand any language. And when you think about that in action, it has an impressive amount of utility. I mean, this extends even to like the language of computer programming. However, Doug is a pretty insecure person, and he does not immediately see how effective his power can be, and he has trouble sort of fitting in with the rest of the team. He is often portrayed in this run as a bit of an outsider, and even is a bit reluctant to embrace his mutant identity like some of the others have. Though I should say, this desire for acceptance and belonging is definitely not a unique characteristic of Doug, but it is explored in a slightly different way. So let's start off by taking a look at how we are first introduced to Doug in the New Mutants issue 13. Now, when it comes to Doug, Claremont slowly weaves him into the story, so while he does appear in this issue, it's really just for a couple of pages, but we do get some important information from this. We first meet him as a friend of Kitty Pryde's. Their relationship is based off of a mutual respect and intellectual connection. In this issue, the two are working together to hack into Sebastian Shaw's information and hack into the Hellfire Club's computer systems. And this is even a little bit of a tease for the power that we will later see Doug manifest, because when it comes to computers, he already has this aptitude for the realm of computer programming, which is a language. And him and Kitty work well together in that regard because she is also really great with technology, as we know. But really in this issue, we just see Doug as a friendly and smart team who's got this relationship with Kitty Pryde, and they're slowly pulling him into the world of X-Men. This is his first stepping stone, Sebastian Shaw research and Hellfire Club research. And seemingly this has even put Doug on the radar for the Hellfire Club, as in one of his next appearances in this story, we see him trying to catch up with Kitty Pryde because he has some important news to tell her, and eventually he does tell her when he shows up to the mansion when the New Mutants are having a party. And that information is that he has just been offered a full Foundation scholarship, and he's going to go do an interview at the school, and he would like for Kitty to accompany him. And that school is the Massachusetts Academy, which, if you are unfamiliar, that is run by Emma Frost and is associated with the Hellfire Club. Okay, and as we're getting into this first storyline, let me just say that there are some issues here with it in regards to the writing, with Doug intersecting with mutants for the first time, but there's also some pretty foundational contextual stuff that we need in here, so it's important to go over. So we then cut to Uncanny X-Men number 180, where this storyline continues, and we see Doug and Kitty playing some arcade game at the mall, just further establishing the friendship that they have. And this is important because it's in contrast to Peter Colossus, who starts to show a little jealousy throughout this friendship, because as you may know, at this time it was established there was a 5-year age gap between Kitty Pryde and Colossus, and Doug is the same age as Kitty, so they sort of have more relevance in what they can talk about. They both like video games, they're both like tech nerds, and we're not talking about Colossus, but in regards to this relationship, he can be pretty immature and insecure in his own ways. One funny thing that does happen here is that Kitty's a true gamer, guys. She literally gets such a high score on this arcade machine that she gets kicked out of the mall along with Doug. So the two of them end up going to grab lunch somewhere, and we get this conversation where Kitty is sort of talking about some issues that she's dealing with, obviously feeling very comfortable with Doug. Issues like Storm was going through a lot of personal changes within herself. Very interesting storyline for her. Changes both literally and figuratively. So she's got her exterior mohawk look then, and then she's also got a lot of stuff that's going on inside of her emotion-wise. And that change scares Kitty because she had sort of looked at her as a kind of maternal figure, and it seemed like Storm was veering further and further away from that. And it sort of mirrored the other conversational topic that Kitty brings up with Doug, which is her parents' divorce, which is a pretty vulnerable thing for, teens to be chatting about. So I think, again, it shows that level of comfort with Doug. Pivoting, though, to what he thinks is good news, Doug starts talking about the Massachusetts Academy invite he received, and again, how he really wants Kitty to come with him, but, obviously Emma Frost runs that school, and in her first appearance she tries to kidnap Kitty, so Kitty's sort of got a bad image of the place, which she alludes to with Doug, but she doesn't explicitly tell him the full reasoning. And it's important to note that Doug doesn't know that she's a mutant at this time, and I don't think they're close enough yet for that to be revealed. So she's kind of just stuck in this position of, do I tell Doug that truth, or do I go up there with him for support just in case? But that solution presents its own challenges too, like that she may be the victim of another attempted kidnapping. So Kitty turns to the X-Men, and Doug is not in this part, but he is discussed here, so again, a lot of context stuff where Doug isn't necessarily there, but it's important things to know about him. So she needs advice from them about the situation and her thoughts on it so far, and Kitty basically is making the argument that she thinks it will be okay for her to go, because Emma Frost is actually presumed to still be in a coma at this time, which happened when she first encountered Jean Grey. Charles Xavier also very comedically and casually just drops here, I wonder if they want Doug because they know he's a mutant. And Kitty is shocked. She did not know this information. They've both been mutants this whole time. Very important to note here, though, that Doug also does not know that he's a mutant, and the professor tells Kitty not to let him know that because he has a quiet power, one that's more useful in the rest of the world than it would be with the X-Men. Charles Xavier, you are not beating the utilize my students as a paramilitary group allegations. But anyway, Kitty and Doug depart from LaGuardia and make their way to the Massachusetts Academy on a private jet, no less. Also sort of interesting here, I could not find concretely what Doug thinks Kitty's relationship with the X-Men is. I mean, the members of the X-Men aren't unknown to people, and also, Lockheed is there seeing them off too, who is a dragon, so I don't know, it's interesting. There's perhaps an answer for this, but I also think that there's a lot of little moments with Doug that Claremont just did not flesh out, and I don't necessarily blame him for not fleshing them out, since there are so many powerhouse characters in this that he wanted to focus on, and there's so many, connecting through lines and growth that is going on. So, as was with Amara, aka Magma, a lot of Doug's stuff sort of gets pushed down and is forgotten about. And we're gonna see some more of that as this storyline progresses, because while Doug is the gateway into this, he's not really the one that it's all about. But hey, guess who's on that private jet that they just boarded? And someone who may be back to their old kidnapping ways, Emma Frost, the White Queen. Yeah, so Kitty does get kidnapped again, and when she is kidnapped, we get more important insight into Doug and Kitty's relationship here, and how Doug truly perceives it, because Emma, having captured them both, shows Kitty a hologram of Doug at the moment, who is currently under Emma's mind control, and is hallucinating that he's with his sort of idealized version of Kitty Pryde, who he is holding, he's kissing, and that's because, as Emma reveals, he loves her. So Emma sort of outs that love/infatuation here, and Kitty claims that Emma's lying, but this does seem to be the truth for Doug, and based on what we know about him and the sort of infatuations that he does get with characters throughout this run, yeah, it seems true. And interesting enough, when Kitty claims that Emma is lying, Emma reveals to her that she also senses Kitty having some feelings for Doug in that regard, but Kitty denies it, possibly out of embarrassment, possibly it's a more subconscious feeling that even she doesn't have a firm grasp on, or possibly it's just Emma engaging in some psychological warfare, not something she's not known to do. I tend to believe that maybe the subconscious route is a little more accurate though, and that those feelings were still developing. Eventually though, the rest of the New Mutants catch on to Kitty having been kidnapped, and they go off to save her and Doug. Well, mainly Kitty, but Doug is there too, and Cannonball and Magma are actually the pair that end up finding Doug once they've gotten to the academy and everyone's sort of split up, but not before they are encountered by Empath, who controls their emotions to make them think they love him, but then Doug shows up and his presence and words snaps them out of it. And because Empath was the one that was guarding him, I think we can also presume here that Empath was using his emotional manipulation abilities, which is his mutant power actually, on Doug as well. So really in Doug's first mutant action moment, he is mentally assaulted by both Emma and Empath. And this is also where Doug realizes for the first time that Cannonball and Magma have superpowers even, but that actually ends up not mattering so much because Emma shows up and then literally mind wipes the three of them right after this interaction anyway. And all the New Mutants who came to try and save Kitty and Doug, aside from Danny and Ileana, end up getting captured along with them. Though again, funny enough, Doug is not in the room where all the others are kept. Not sure how intentional that is and how much it's just a tertiary character being, well, like super tertiary. And again, we get scenes of them all fitted in the Hellions outfits, which is the New Mutants team equivalent of the Massachusetts Academy, but Doug is still nowhere to be seen in there. Like, once the team is captured, Doug really just sort of disappears from this storyline. Even, after Danny and Ileana come back to save the rest of the New Mutants and everything, and that's all resolved, when they're going home, Doug is just straight up not with them. And I've said it before, Claremont is not perfect. He's one of my favorite writers of all time, and these comics get complicated and there's a lot to think about and there's a lot of characters, but it does read as a little sloppy that the Doug thing is not resolved here. But what we did at least get from this storyline is some foundational information about Doug. And have no fear, somehow he does get home because we see him next in New Mutants issue 21. Now, this is a standout issue for multiple reasons. First of all, it also is the first appearance of Warlock, a techno-organic alien who crashes onto Earth while fleeing from his father, and not only does Warlock eventually join the New Mutants team, but Cypher does as well in this issue, which makes sense since these two characters will go on to form one of the stronger and more unique bonds among the team. And we're going to talk more about Warlock since him and Doug's friendship is really critical to Doug's character and story, but if you would like to learn more about things from a Warlock-focused perspective, I also have a New Mutants video just like this one on him. Now, this issue is also pretty important for Doug in the short-term sense though too, because this is where he's first able to sort of step up with his mutant gift of mastery over language, as he's the one who breaks down the communication barrier between the New Mutants and Warlock. So we get Doug getting a success for the team in this issue, because otherwise they may have seen Warlock as dangerous and the situation could have and likely would have just devolved and devolved. But not only does Doug get a success, but he gets one as this teen who, if we think about it from his perspective, hasn't really had too much experience with anything fantastical yet, and here he is stepping in to translate for an alien, a very strange and scary looking alien, and he emits the bravery he has to in order to do it. And yes, so this is the start of the real relationship between Warlock and Doug, which is one of the most enduring from the New Mutants and in comics in general, and the dynamic that's going on here between these two is pretty interesting as far as relationships go, because it is a big brother, little brother type situation, although it does oscillate. So for example, Doug becomes sort of Warlock's mentor for what it means to be human and whatnot, and sort of figuring out the emotional playing field that Warlock is now built into. But when things get tough, Warlock, being more physically capable than Doug, will take on that big brother role and really protect Doug, and we see that exemplified in more intense ways later on as well. And what I mean when I say that is, in a sense, they complete each other later on, and when I say that, it's because they have a fusion that is both metaphorical and literal, because, in the metaphorical sense, Warlock fills in a lot of the gaps of Doug when it comes to his physical limitations, and Doug fills in the gaps of Warlock when it comes to anything emotional or intellectually grounding that he needs to know to survive the human world. And we will talk more later about Warlock as a protector for Doug, because there is some emotionally poignant stuff that goes on there towards the end of this run. Before moving on though, I think it is worth mentioning that this issue does sort of rehash a lot of things that Doug's previous sort of introduction to the Hellions and New Mutants already sort of did, but then he got mind wiped. So yeah, again, here we do get Doug learning that he's a mutant, learning that the others are mutants too, being thrown into this crazy scenario, and sort of officially becoming a member of the team. And as Doug gets a little bit more of the spotlight since he's now joined the team, he also starts to face some more immediate challenges, and we see the cracks in the character a little bit more, because again, he already sort of feels out of place as a new mutant in this mutant world, but he also feels out of place with the other mutants because, as we've stated before, his power doesn't seem inherently valuable in the sense that they would utilize it during their combat. And this is a feeling that is made worse because he often has to watch the combat from the sidelines, and he can't really help out his friends or build that bond in the way that they can with each other. And that's not to say we don't have moments where Doug is getting along with the team, but I think there's a really clear contrast in this book that we see moments of Doug fitting in, kind of, and then moments of Doug in frustrated isolation. That's sort of the two states of Doug that we get. And even though he does build some closer relationships with some other members of the New Mutants, he does still always seem like he's trying very hard to prove his worth to them. For example, we also see, when Doug is joining the team, a relationship start to form between him and Illyana Rasputin, who is magic. And she is a sort of dark and mysterious character, and he is more of an intellectual, reserved character, and you wouldn't necessarily think that those two would go together, but there is a bond there that is subtle, and it grows compellingly throughout the story. And there's reasons for that too, I believe. And it's likely because of a shared experience in feeling like outsiders, which, yes, in a sense, all of the mutants feel like outsiders in multiple ways, likely. But I think it's safe to say that Illyana is one of the more traumatized members of the team, who has a pretty terrible upbringing and origin story. And on the flip side of that, that equally probably makes her one of the more resilient members of the team, especially considering how long she had to survive in her terrible origin. So, despite the hard and sarcastic exterior she will often present in the New Mutants, I think she really does see Doug's struggle with feeling out of place, because Illyana, having spent all that time in her own isolation and with her own grief and her own trauma, is pretty emotionally mature. And so I think that she's very clued in to him not fitting in with the team and him having a lot of trouble assimilating with them. And she does in her own ways too, but she also, because she has that sort of survivor aspect to her, is able to, I think, put on faces and play roles and fit in much better ways, even when she may not be interior feeling that. So she will often also take on the protector role for Doug in this story, but it's not like she's treating him out of pity or anything like that. She's not treating him like he's incapable. Instead, she's just treating him like a friend who needs help in this regard. She's faced her own demons, both literally and metaphorically, and she sees Doug as someone who's fighting his own demons, and she tries to uplift and help in any way she can. Now, let's talk about New Mutants Annual number 2, which is where we see Doug Ramsey's probably most significant solo moment in this run, where he's able to have his powers sort of take center stage and be the real hero. And even essentially the point of the issue is to explore Doug's insecurity with his powers and maybe put it to rest here, although it isn't necessarily put to rest here. So this annual of the New Mutants involves Mojo, who, if you don't know, he's an interdimensional villain who's basically obsessed with television ratings, and he lives in the Mojoverse. He captures Betsy Braddock, Psylocke, a later member of the X-Men, and also the sister of Brian Braddock, the current Captain Britain at the time that this came out. And this whole issue actually starts off with some angsty Doug doodles and writing, because we actually get this opening splash page where it's Doug drawing Warlock, and he's got, why do we do these things we do written on it. And Danny sees Doug, struggling a little bit, and so they end up having this conversation where Doug basically tells her he is emotionally feeling like he is always left out. He doesn't feel like there's a spot in the world that he fits in. It's hard being a mutant. It's hard being a mutant whose abilities doesn't feel like an ability that matches up with the rest of the teams. And she basically tells him, hey, look, it is what it is, and we all feel like outsiders at a time, and we may just have to do the best with what we have. But I'm gonna try to do the best with what I have, aren't you, Doug? Trying to encourage him. Anyway, moving on, as if Doug was already not in a sorry state, he ends up thinking he accidentally caused the death of Roberto, aka Sunspot, and that is because the three of them, Warlock, Sunspot, and Doug, were going to go uproot this tree at the Xavier Institute, and Warlock forms a suit around Doug so they can do it, so he's strong on that side, but Roberto is not strong on his side, and he gets crushed by the tree, and Doug is like, I thought he could handle it, I thought he could take it, and normally Roberto would be able to take that, you know, he is Sunspot, but this was actually just a decoy Sunspot, like a robot type thing, I suppose, that must have seemed pretty lifelike, but from the Mojo-verse, because Sunspot has actually been kidnapped by Mojo. Now, Doug is incredibly distraught over this death. He is blaming himself. He doesn't know what to do. He's angry, lashing out. He's mad at Danny even for not being able to predict this death, not using her Valkyrie powers to be able to see it, which theoretically she should have been able to, except Roberto didn't really die. And we get this very heartwarming moment here with Warlock and Doug that again re-emphasizes the bond that these two have and how it is much greater than even friend, and it is really truly a familial style bond. And that is when Doug runs off sad, you know, in his feelings, and Sam is like, okay, we should maybe give him some space, but Warlock is like, no, my friend is in pain, I need to be with him, I need to, and he goes and he bees with Doug in that moment. This eventually leads Doug and Warlock to checking out the body, and Warlock basically discovers that it is a decoy, and Sunspot is not dead. So, clearly something nefarious is going on, which you already know is Mojo. So Warlock and the team are able to track Roberto's life glow, and it leads them to basically the spot where Roberto and some other younger mutants have been kidnapped. And what's really important for you all to know here is that Doug and Warlock get isolated from the team here, and the team does get kidnapped by Mojo, and everyone basically gets aged up into, you know, adult versions of themselves. So we then get a showcase of Warlock and Doug working together, Warlock's alien shape-shifting abilities being really helpful here, and Doug's linguistic and computational skills about to come into play for a critical moment. It is also worth noting that Doug does run into Brian Braddock here, who has been de-aged, so he's a younger, kiddified, and scared version of himself, and this is thematically important because it sort of is a reflection of Doug's own struggles with insecurity and being in the presence of someone who at that moment is, you know, radiating more insecure and scared energy than himself. He's able to sort of empathize and connect with Brian on an emotional level and help inspire and push him further. Pretty much mirroring that conversation that Doug had with Danny earlier. And what ends up being the case is that Doug and Warlock are able to figure out a solution for saving Betsy, but they're going to have to merge with each other and again intertwine both of their abilities to do it. And this is another brave moment in this issue for Doug here. Truly, this is like his issue of this run, because he tells Warlock when he learns there's a risk that he may die from this process, that if he has to die in order to save the life of another, then perhaps it's worth it. But yeah, basically, long story short, operating on the same wavelength, Doug and Warlock are able to save the day. They save Psylocke, they save the team. Doug maybe gets a little crush on Psylocke, but it is a pivotal turning point for him because he feels more confident now in his role as a strategist and member of the team. Now, another relationship I do want to mention pretty quickly because it's interesting is Doug's with Magneto, because after Magneto takes over as headmaster of the Xavier Institute, Magneto is pretty quickly dismissive of Doug when it comes to him training with the rest of the team in the danger room and whatnot, because Doug, again, does not have a physical power, so Magneto doesn't think he needs to be really training and taking part like that, which is kind of a failure on Magneto's part as a teacher, and eventually in this run he does realize that was incorrect and that Doug does have value in that sense. But it is just interesting because this adds another layer where Doug's struggle for validation intensifies, and intensifies at the behest of an authority figure. Now, I am also going to move slightly past Claremont's run here on the New Mutants because, spoilers for those who don't know, once Louise Simonson takes over, we do get the death of Doug Ramsey in issue number 60. Now, I'm pretty sure that Louise Simonson, though, was also working off a lot of notes that Claremont had given her for narrative stuff. I don't know explicitly if the death of Doug Ramsey was one of those things. It seemed to me from when I was reading researching it that Louise Simonson just said a bunch of fans had been sending in letters being like, we hate Doug, we think he's such an annoying character, etc., etc. And then conversely, I think she also said when they did end up killing Doug, that is when they got an influx of fan letters being like, why did you kill Doug? We loved Doug so much. So just kind of a funny comic history note here. But again, I think it's worth bringing up Doug dying here because it ends his character arc for this sort of iteration of the New Mutants, and he also dies via sacrifice, saving Rain Sinclair from dying. The exact details of it are not super important. It involves like bird brain and all that stuff, so not really my favorite material or material I want to dig in too deeply. Now, I don't think Doug's characterization and his through line in this run is perfect by any means. I think I've let that be known and I've made that very clear throughout this video. I do think it is slightly successful in closing it in a haphazardly way, if that makes sense, because with his death, we do get to see, you know, our non-combative, called useless many times member of the team prove that he's got some courage and that he is willing to go through with that self-sacrifice. And so, my final thoughts on Doug Ramsey in this run. I think he's a really interesting character who has a ton of fascinating potential and the potential to carry a really deep and resonant message, which I think a lot of people actually do still get from this run in a sense, but I think it just scratches the surface of all of it with his feelings of insecurity and inadequacies. I just feel like he could have been a really, really fascinating template to explore much more heavily how communication, compassion, and emotional intelligence are just as heroic as any other superpower and are just as important, or even maybe more so important, than the ability to just brute force punch your way through problems. And again, a lot of that is here in the run. It just gets diluted by a lot of the other characters who have their own really, really interesting and well done thematic through lines. So with that, thank you guys for watching this video. You all have a great rest of your day. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We just hit 2,000, which is incredible, so thank you all so much.